All right, what's going on, everybody? Merry Christmas. We're getting into the festive spirit a little bit early. Today, we're doing one of the classic Christmas drinks. We're doing eggnog. And if you can't tell, I got my Christmas vacation sweater on. See, I got the little eggnog mousse right there. So I'm ready to go. Hope you're ready to go. Eggnog, I'm sure everybody has heard of it or at least knows about it. But what you don't know is the history behind it, and it's incredibly interesting. I'm telling you, this one surprised me when I was doing the research. I think you're really going to enjoy it, so buckle up and let's get into it. So eggnog's first ancestor is called posset. So posset was used during the Middle Ages as a medicine for the poor. So access to milk at this time was really only available to the rich. The poor got it when they really needed it, but it was readily available to the rich only. So the way this posset would work in the Middle Ages is you would typically get some hot milk, mix it with a cheap wine or ale, and then that alcohol mixed with the hot milk would cause the milk to curdle on top. And then, as disgusting as it sounds, you just drink it back really quickly, and it's supposed to help with ailments like the cold or if you're under the weather or something like that. It sounds disgusting, but the wealthy of the time obviously got a few more luxuries than the poor, and they didn't enjoy posset in the same way. Basically, they had access to things like sugar and exotic spices. So what they would do is they would take the posset and mix it the same way. They would take the hot milk and they would mix it with a nicer alcohol, and it would still cause the milk to curdle on top. But the difference is they would add a lot of those sugars in. They would add a lot of those exotic spices that they had access to, and then they would take the curdled milk from the top and eat it with a spoon, except it was a lot sweeter, and it had those really nice spices like the nutmeg and stuff like that, and they would just eat the top. That alcohol would sink to the bottom, and they would just use a straw and drink it straight out the bottom of that thing. So the rich had a few more luxuries. It was a little more tasty of a drink. It was more like a dessert to the rich instead of a medicine like it was to the poor in the Middle Ages. And that's the first ancestor of eggnog. That's called posset. Posset was so popular during the Middle Ages that it even got its own little container, which I'll show you right now. And it was more like a treat. It was a delectable dessert. Really, people looked forward to this type. The rich people looked forward to this type of dessert, and it's even brought up in a lot of Shakespeare plays, such as Hamlet, Macbeth, The Merry Wives of Windsor. It's extremely popular at this time. That's the main takeaway from this. In the Middle Ages, medicinal for the poor, extremely popular for the rich because they were afforded the luxuries of sugar and spices that they could add to it. So you may be wondering, where the hell are the eggs at? This is eggnog, where are the eggs? And that's what we're getting to next. So the next iteration of eggnog goes from posset to syllabub. Syllabub is another delectable dessert type drink, and this is where the eggs come in. So some monks used eggs to thicken up the posset to make it more delectable and creamy, but it wouldn't become really popular and standard to add the eggs to the posset until around the 17th, 18th century. This is when it becomes more of a delectable dessert to the upper and middle classes instead of that medicinal element that you would see with the poor classes in previous, like the Middle Ages. At the start, syllabubs were served warm, but then as time went on, people started letting them cool off a little bit more, and that's whenever they really took off in popularity. Syllabubs were ultimately very close to possets, except they had those eggs added to them, which made it a little bit thicker, creamier, and then it also had a little bit less alcohol than posset, so it was closer to just like your standard dessert that you would have, or a custard or something like that. So there is one method of making syllabub called the hatted kit that was mentioned in the 1769 book, The Experienced English Housekeeper by Elizabeth Raffald. Basically, you have a cup of ale, and you get some fresh milk from the cow, and you milk the cow directly into the cup of ale until it has a strong froth and the ale turns clear. And that would be your syllabub. You can also add eggs to that to thicken it even further, which would be typical of the 17th, 18th century whenever that got popular. So eventually in the late 18th century, the syllabub really kind of waned in popularity in Europe, but it exploded in popularity in the colonies in the Americas. And this is because the Americas had huge farms, they had access to the ingredients, and they were making it like crazy. It's also worth mentioning that they had easy access to the sugar and spices that would really take this dessert to the next level. It's really at this time that the drink went from being something that was really only for the middle to upper class, except for those terrible iterations of it that were used in a medicinal way for the poor, to really something that was more common to everyone. And that's thanks to the ease of ingredients that the Americas had access to, like I had mentioned previous. So the American colonies are also credited with correlating eggnog to the holidays because they needed a way to keep their milk and eggs fresh, and it would give them something warm to enjoy during the winter months, and thus started the correlation between eggnog and the holidays. It was so popular in the colonies that many people had their own recipes, and George Washington was no different. This was his recipe. I'll put it up on the screen for you. This was George Washington's recipe, estimated to be around 1780. This would have been the recipe that they enjoyed at Mount Vernon for a large number of guests in the holidays. So at this time, whenever the dessert is skyrocketing in the colonies, this is when the alcohol starts to change a bit. It's no longer the expensive wines and brandies. It changes over to more of the American rums and whiskeys. The Americans then started calling it egg and grog because it was served in a wooden glass called a noggin. And then eventually the word eggnog would be entered into the lexicon. It became so popular during the American Revolution that a group of students at West Point actually rioted for eggnog. It was a group of about 20 of them, and they kind of went behind the back of their commanding officer to sneak out, get some eggnog, and they all ended up getting court-martialed for their activities. So was it worth it? Who knows? It must have been some really good eggnog. As you can see, the point of the story is eggnog is extremely popular in the Americas, and the Americas really took it from that delectable dessert that was only allowed to the upper class to more of something that all common people could enjoy, and they also spiked it heavily with alcohol, as Americans tend to do. But the 19th century really wasn't that eventful for eggnog. Basically, it just eventually evolves into a drink that is served cold and associated strictly with the holidays. All kind of recipes emerge at this time. This is when people start experimenting with just their own homemade recipes, and eggnog really gets dialed into a family favorite and a family tradition. So it wouldn't be a complete history of eggnog if we didn't mention cartoned eggnog or the first iterations of store-bought eggnog. So the first iterations was in a powder form around the 1920s. This was before refrigeration was standard technology in the American household. Basically, you'd go get a packet and it would be a little powdered form of eggnog that you would mix for the holidays. But even now, whenever eggnog is readily available and refrigeration is all over, the cartons that you can buy in the store, and I don't know how to put more emphasis on this, the cartons you can buy in the store do not hold a candle to homemade eggnog. If you've never made homemade eggnog, I'll put a recipe at the end of this video. It'll be on the screen. You can screenshot it. You can save it. I'm telling you, make some homemade eggnog. It will change your life. Homemade eggnog with some nice brandy or whatever, whiskey, rum, whatever you want to put in it, whatever's your favorite liquor of choice, is phenomenal. And it just destroys any of the store-bought eggnog you can get. So I highly recommend it. So yeah, just to recap, basically you start off with posset, and then you get eggs added to it. That would be syllable, but still at this time it's a wealthy class type dessert. And then eventually when it makes its way over to the Americas, all the ingredients become readily available. The Americans mix in more accessible liquor, and it explodes in popularity, and everybody's drinking it. Everybody loves it, and it's a way for them to keep their milk and eggs fresh during the winter months and to drink something warm. And that's when it gets really associated with the holidays. And then you start seeing the evolution of it, especially in the 19th century, of people making more of their homemade eggnog and really experimenting with recipes. And then once refrigeration comes around, you find out just how many people want to sell eggnog. And there's so many different eggnogs. There are some really good ones, but I'm telling you, make a homemade eggnog. This is when I'll put up the recipe for you. Take a screenshot of it, make it for your family and friends for the holidays. And that's all I've got for you for the history of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you all have a great holidays with your friends and family. Try some eggnog. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.